Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases in history. There is a name that still sends shivers down the spine when pronounced in the Appalachian Mountains. A name linked to unexplained disappearances, an isolated mansion, and secrets that have remained buried for generations. Evelyn Burke was known as the heiress of one of the most influential families in the region, but behind her refined appearance lay something far darker. This video is a work of fiction created solely for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. The Burke family's property was located on the outskirts of a small community in eastern Kentucky, a mountainous area where roads were poor and neighbors lived separated by miles of dense forest. It was 1908 when the first rumors began to circulate. Travelers passing through the region mentioned an elegant woman who offered shelter to those who got lost on the winding trails. She was described as strikingly beautiful, with clear eyes and a smile that seemed to hold ancient secrets. Her voice was soft, almost hypnotic, and few could refuse her hospitality. The Burke mansion was an imposing structure by local standards, 3 stories of dark wood, surrounded by centuries-old oak trees that blocked the sunlight even during the day. The property had been built by Evelyn's grandfather, a man who made his fortune in coal mining and who mysteriously disappeared years before his granddaughter took over the residence. According to county records, the family employed few people and rarely received official visitors. It was as if that house existed in its own dimension, far removed from the social conventions of the time. Evelyn never married, something unusual for a woman of her position at that time. Some said she had lost a fiancé in her youth and never considered another relationship. Others whispered that she preferred solitude, that there was something wrong with her nature. What no one questioned was her ability to attract attention. When she appeared in the nearest town, she always caused a mixture of fascination and discomfort. Men looked at her with interest, women looked away. It was on an autumn afternoon that a merchant named Thomas Whitmore passed by the Burke estate. He was coming from Virginia and on his way to a neighboring town for business when his wagon broke down near the entrance to the mansion. Evelyn appeared before he could even decide what to do. She offered help, inviting him to dinner while her servants repaired the broken axle. Thomas accepted, grateful for the unexpected kindness. It was the last time anyone saw him alive. Local sheriff's records show that Thomas's wife contacted the authorities 2 weeks later, concerned about her husband's absence. The investigations led to the Burke mansion, where Evelyn received the officers politely. She confirmed that Thomas had dined there, but assured them that he left early the next morning. His wagon was found abandoned miles away, but there were no signs of violence. The case was filed as a voluntary disappearance, something not so uncommon in those days of still wild frontiers. But Thomas wasn't the only one. In the following years, other men disappeared after passing through the region, always solitary travelers, always without close family to demand answers. The community began to avoid that road, preferring longer routes. Evelyn continued to appear occasionally in town, buying supplies, exchanging a few words. No one dared accuse her directly. After all, she was a Burke, and the Burkes had influence. The mansion held an architectural secret known to few. Beneath the main basement lay another level, a chamber carved into the solid rock of the mountain. This space had originally been created as a coal storage room, but over time it acquired another purpose. The walls were thick, the access disguised by a heavy door covered with shelves. It was a place where sounds did not escape, where the darkness was absolute. County records reveal a disturbing pattern. Between 1908 and 1914, at least 7 men disappeared in the vicinity of the Burke property. All were outsiders, merchants, or workers in transit. Some left belongings at local inns, unsent letters, promises of return that never materialized. Distant families sent unanswered telegrams. The sheriff at the time, a man named Harold Brennan, recorded each occurrence with growing frustration. But without concrete evidence, his hands remained tied. Evelyn maintained a peculiar routine. According to accounts from merchants who served her, she bought unusual quantities of salted meat, preserves, and provisions that would last for months. She also acquired heavy-duty tools, chains, and sturdy padlocks. When questioned, she explained that she had maintained the property alone since her parents' death and needed to be prepared for any eventuality. The explanation seemed reasonable on the surface, but left a trail of doubts. The Burke mansion possessed features that made it ideal for isolation. The basement windows were small and positioned well above ground level. allowing only diffused light during the day. Access to the property required crossing a wooden bridge over a creek that during the winter became impassable for weeks. It was as if the house had been designed to keep the outside world at bay, to protect secrets that should not be discovered. In 1912, an event nearly changed everything. A man named Samuel Porter managed to escape. He had been invited to stay overnight at the mansion after his horse was injured on the trail. During the night, he awoke in a dark and cold place, realizing he was no longer in the guest room. With considerable effort, he managed to force his way through and flee into the forest. He reached the nearest town with torn clothes, deliriously talking about underground chambers and eyes watching him in the darkness. The authorities considered him disturbed, possibly affected by a fever or by having consumed contaminated water. Samuel insisted on his story, describing the interior architecture of the mansion in detail, seemingly impossible for someone who had only dined there. He spoke of chains fixed to stone walls, the smell of dampness and decay, and voices echoing in a vast space underground. Sheriff Brennan took notes, but when he went to investigate, Evelyn again received him courteously, denied any wrongdoing, and offered him a tour of the house. The cellar shown to the sheriff was ordinary. Shelves with preserves, barrels of water, organized farming tools. No secret chambers or chains. Samuel was deemed unreliable, possibly traumatized by some experience in the forest. He left the region soon after, his accusations ignored. Years later, records showed that Samuel never reached his final destination. He disappeared somewhere along the way, swallowed by the vastness of the mountains. Evelyn continued her quiet existence. She occasionally attended social events in town, donated to the local church, and maintained a reputation as an eccentric but respectable woman. Her fortune remained intact, her taxes were paid punctually, and no formal complaint could be brought against her. The Burke Mansion was seen as a local landmark, a historic property that had witnessed the region's growth. Few dared to question what truly went on within those ancient walls. But the forest holds secrets that eventually emerge. Hunters began reporting strange finds in the more remote areas around the property. Pieces of fabric caught on branches, abandoned personal belongings, marks on the ground suggesting something heavy had been dragged. Nothing conclusive, just fragments of a larger narrative that no one could fully piece together. People preferred not to overthink it, not to investigate beyond the surface. After all, some truths are more comfortable when they remain buried. Evelyn Burke's reputation was built on layers of contradictions. To some, she represented the aristocratic decadence of the old Appalachian families, women who inherited fortunes but lived isolated on dilapidated estates. To others, she was simply an eccentric, someone who chose solitude over social conventions. No one spoke openly about the suspicions hanging over her name, but everyone felt their weight when they met her penetrating gaze. The region's newspapers rarely mentioned the disappearances. In 1915, the local periodical published a vague article about the need to improve mountain roads, citing the dangers travelers faced when crossing remote areas. The text mentioned regrettable losses without naming anyone, without pointing fingers. It was as if there was a tacit agreement of silence, a collective decision not to disturb the established order. After all, questioning a Burke meant questioning the power structure that had sustained that community for generations. Evelyn had a peculiar ability to identify vulnerable targets. She never approached men traveling in groups or who had urgent commitments waiting for them. Her victims were always those whom no one would persistently seek out. Men without deep roots. Itinerant workers who moved from city to city in search of opportunities. She offered hospitality at the exact moment they needed it most. When night fell and the forest became menacing, when the promise of a roof over their heads and a hot meal seemed like a blessing, the mansion had an almost living presence. Occasional visitors, those few who were received and subsequently dismissed, described a feeling of constant unease. The wood creaked at specific times. Drafts of cold air ran through the corridors, even with all the windows closed. Shadows seemed to move where there should be no movement. Some attributed these sensations to the age of the building. Others preferred to believe that places like this absorb the energies of the events they witness. In 1917, with the country entering the Great War, many young men from the region left to serve. The community contracted, and vigilance over suspicious behavior decreased. Evelyn took advantage of this period of collective distraction. Records show an increase in reports of disappearances, although many were attributed to the chaos of war and the disorganization of communication systems. Families assumed that their loved ones had impulsively enlisted or migrated to larger cities in search of work in armaments factories. There is a particularly disturbing document in the county archives, a letter written by a man named Robert Fielding, dated October 1918, addressed to his brother in Ohio. In it, Robert mentions having accepted an invitation to dinner at Mrs. Burke's house and planning to leave the next day. The letter was found years later in a batch of undelivered mail, lost during a reorganization of the local post office. Robert never arrived in Ohio. His brother waited for news until 1920, when he finally traveled to Kentucky, trying to reconstruct his missing brother's last steps. Robert's brother, a man named Edward Fielding, was more persistent than others. He spent weeks interviewing locals, reviewing inn records, following the route Robert would have taken. Each clue brought him closer to the Burke property. When he finally confronted Evelyn, she maintained her polite, innocent demeanor. She confirmed that Robert had dined there, praised his pleasant company, and regretted not being able to help more. Edward left that meeting convinced she was lying, but without any way to prove it. Edward tried to convince the authorities to investigate the mansion's basement more thoroughly. The sheriff at the time, a replacement for Harold Brennan, who had died in 1916, was reluctant. He explained that they had already searched the property previously, and that they could not violate the rights of a respectable citizen without solid evidence. Edward insisted, even offering to pay for a more detailed search, but was ignored. Frustrated and without legal recourse, he returned to Ohio carrying only suspicions and an emptiness that would never be filled. The war was over. The survivors returned home, and life in the mountains gradually returned to its slow pace. Evelyn Burke remained a constant figure in that landscape, a presence that inspired both respect and unspoken fear. Her mansion stood, a silent witness to secrets that the stone and wood walls guarded with absolute loyalty. The following years brought subtle changes to the Appalachian region, but the Burke mansion seemed to exist outside of time. While other properties were being modernized with electricity and telephones, Evelyn's residence maintained its original appearance. Oil lamps still illuminated the rooms at night, the artesian well remained the only source of water, and the access road remained unpaved. It was as if she deliberately refused any connection with the outside world that could facilitate unwanted interference. In 1921, the local community organized an informal census to update county records. An official named Martin Crawford was assigned to visit the more isolated properties, including the Burke mansion. He arrived on a rainy spring afternoon, when the humidity made the air heavy and the fog covered the mountains like a thick blanket. Evelyn greeted him with her usual courtesy, offering him tea while answering bureaucratic questions. Martin noticed details that disturbed him, small things he couldn't rationally explain. There were stains on the wooden floor of the main hallway, discolorations that looked like they had been repeatedly scrubbed, but never completely disappeared. The house smelled peculiar, a mixture of mold, damp earth, and something else he couldn't quite identify. During the conversation, Martin heard sounds coming from downstairs, a metallic creak followed by silence. When he asked about it, Evelyn explained that it was just the old pipes, that the property had its quirks after so many decades. The explanation was plausible, but it left Martin uneasy. Before leaving, Martin asked to use the restroom. Evelyn hesitated for a brief moment before indicating the way. As he walked down the hallway, he noticed a half-open door revealing stairs descending into the darkness. Curiosity compelled him to take a few steps toward the opening. But Evelyn's voice stopped him. She had appeared silently behind him, her tone still polite but laden with something indefinable. She suggested he use the upstairs bathroom, as the one in the basement had plumbing problems. Martin obeyed, but the image of those stairs remained etched in his memory. Back at the county office, Martin mentioned his visit to his colleagues. He spoke about the unsettling feeling the mansion evoked, the strange sounds, and Evelyn's insistence on keeping him away from certain areas. The senior employees exchanged meaningful glances. One of them, a man named George Tillman, who had worked there for 30 years, pulled Martin aside and told him about the rumors that had been circulating for decades. He spoke of the disappearances, the unconfirmed suspicions, the silent fear the community harbored regarding the Burke heiress. George explained that several attempts at investigation had been thwarted over the years. The Burke family's influence extended beyond what was apparent on the surface. They had financed the construction of the local church, donated land for the municipal cemetery, and helped struggling families during times of scarcity. This network of favors created an invisible shield, a barrier of gratitude and fear that made any accusation against Evelyn socially impossible. Questioning the Burkes was questioning the very foundation of the community. Martin was disturbed by these revelations. He spent weeks reviewing old records, looking for patterns in the disappearances. He discovered that at least 12 men had vanished in the vicinity of the Burke property between 1908 and 1921. They all shared similar characteristics. They traveled alone, had no family in the area, and were outsiders without strong local ties. The last confirmed location of most of them was always in the vicinity of that isolated mansion. The coincidences were too numerous to ignore. He tried to convince the sheriff to reopen the investigations. He prepared a detailed document listing all the occurrences, drawing connections between the cases, arguing that the volume of circumstantial evidence justified a thorough search of the property. The sheriff, a pragmatic man named Douglas Whitaker, read everything carefully before explaining the political reality of the situation. Without a body, without reliable witnesses, without material evidence, any legal action would be destroyed in court. Furthermore, prosecuting a Burke would have repercussions that could cost him his job. Frustrated but not defeated, Martin began documenting everything on his own. He created a personal archive with copies of records, transcribed testimonies, and maps showing where the belongings of missing persons had been found. His wife noticed his growing obsession and worried about the long nights he spent reviewing papers by candlelight. Martin justified this by saying that someone needed to keep a record, that eventually the truth would emerge, and that it would be necessary to have documentation prepared. In October 1922, Martin received an unexpected visit at his home. Evelyn Burke appeared in the afternoon, elegant as always, carrying a basket of fruit as a gift. She said she had learned through mutual acquaintances about the recent birth of his first child and wanted to congratulate him. The conversation was cordial on the surface, but Martin perceived the subtext. She knew about his research, about the archive he kept. The gift was simultaneously a congratulation and a veiled warning. After that visit, Martin became more cautious. He stored his documents in a safe place outside his home, entrusting copies to a friend in another city. He continued adding information as it surfaced, but avoided confronting Evelyn directly. Her presence in his home, her physical proximity to his family, had made the risks involved clear. He realized he was dealing with someone who operated beyond conventional social norms, someone whose patience had definite limits. Months passed, and new disappearances were reported, though less frequently. Perhaps Evelyn had become more selective, or perhaps the increased traffic on the roads due to post-war economic growth made her actions riskier. The mansion remained shrouded in mystery, its secrets protected by thick walls, and the unwitting complicity of a community that preferred not to see the obvious. Martin continued his solitary vigil, patiently waiting for the day when the evidence would become irrefutable. The 1920s brought significant transformations to the country, but the mountains of Kentucky remained relatively isolated from these changes. While large cities celebrated the Jazz Age and accelerated modernization, the rural communities of the Appalachians maintained traditions and rhythms that seemed immutable. The Burke Mansion remained a somber landmark in that landscape, a structure that defied time and repelled progress. Evelyn was already past 50 in 1925, but maintained a remarkably well-preserved appearance. Her hair was beginning to show silver strands, but her posture remained erect, her movements fluid and calculated. She was rarely seen in town now, preferring to send occasional messengers to fetch supplies. This increased seclusion fueled new rumors. Some said she was falling ill. Others suggested she had simply grown weary of social formalities. The truth, as always, remained obscure. During this period, a young reporter named Benjamin Cole arrived in the region. He worked for a Louisville newspaper and was interested in stories about life in the mountains, preserved customs and local legends. Benjamin was ambitious. He saw in those rural narratives an opportunity to build a professional reputation. When he heard whispers about the mysterious Burke heiress and the unsolved disappearances, his journalistic instinct was fully awakened. Benjamin spent weeks talking to locals, gradually gaining their trust. He discovered that many had stories to tell, but few dared to speak openly. The conversations took place in discreet corners of taverns, on secluded porches, always with nervous glances checking who might be listening. A pattern emerged from these interviews. Everyone knew someone who had disappeared in the vicinity of the Burke property, but no one could or wanted to connect the dots publicly. It was Martin Crawford who finally decided to share his archive with Benjamin. After years of keeping that documentation secret, he recognized that an outside journalist could have the freedom he lacked. They met discreetly in an abandoned hunting cabin, away from prying eyes. Martin opened his files, revealing years of meticulous research. Benjamin was impressed by the depth of the work, the clear connection between the cases, and the undeniable pattern that emerged from the data. However, Benjamin also realized the fundamental problem: everything was circumstantial. Disappearances in rural areas were not uncommon at that time. Men fled from debts, started new lives in distant places, died in accidents in the forests without their bodies being found. To turn that into a publishable story, he would need something more concrete, something that could withstand editorial and possibly legal scrutiny. Benjamin decided to try a direct approach. He showed up at the Burke mansion on a foggy March morning in 1926, identifying himself as a journalist and requesting an interview. Evelyn greeted him with apparent surprise, but agreed to talk. She led him to a living room furnished with antique furniture, where they served coffee, while Benjamin asked carefully worded questions about the family history, their secluded life, and the rumors that were circulating. Evelyn responded with rehearsed elegance. She spoke of her grandfather's legacy, of the difficulties of maintaining a large property alone, of how people always fear what they don't understand. When Benjamin mentioned the disappearances, she sighed with performative sadness. She explained that travelers had always gotten lost in those mountains, that she herself had offered help to many over the years, and that it was unfair to blame her for the tragedies of geography and chance. During the conversation, Benjamin observed everything attentively. He noticed how Evelyn chose her words precisely, how she avoided specific details, how she skillfully redirected uncomfortable questions. Her eyes were particularly intriguing, clear and penetrating, seeming to assess his every reaction. There was a sharp intelligence behind that facade of a country lady, a keen awareness of how to present herself to achieve the desired result. Before leaving, Benjamin asked to photograph the property to accompany his article. Evelyn visibly hesitated, then agreed on the condition that he only photograph the exterior. While Benjamin prepared his equipment, she remained watching his every move, making sure he didn't stray from the permitted areas. The photographs captured the mansion in all its majestic decay, the somber oak trees, the bridge over the creek, but nothing that revealed its inner secrets. Back in Louisville, Benjamin wrote a cautious article. He described the mysterious atmosphere of the region, mentioned the disappearances as a curious phenomenon, and presented Evelyn as an enigmatic figure without making direct accusations. His editor meticulously reviewed the text, removing any suggestion that could be interpreted as defamatory. The article was published in April 1926, generating moderate interest but no concrete action. Benjamin felt frustrated by the dilution of his story, but understood the legal and ethical limitations of journalism. Months later, Benjamin received an anonymous letter. The sender claimed to have worked briefly at the Burke property years before and to have witnessed disturbing things. It mentioned sounds coming from the basement at night, rooms that remained locked, and Evelyn's strict instructions about which areas of the house were absolutely off-limits. The letter provided no name or contact information, only vague suggestions that fueled suspicion without offering proof. Benjamin filed the correspondence away, adding it to the growing body of indirect evidence that would never be enough for a formal accusation. Benjamin's frustration echoed that of Martin Crawford and all the others who had tried to unravel the Burke mystery. The heiress seemed untouchable, protected not only by her social standing, but by a system that demanded impossible standards of proof under the circumstances. Meanwhile, the mansion remained standing, its foundations firmly anchored in the Appalachian rock, its secrets guarded in chambers that daylight never reached. Time passed, but certain truths remained frozen, patiently waiting for the moment when they could no longer be contained. The Great Depression hit the country in 1929, bringing widespread misery and transforming the lives of millions. In the mountains of Kentucky, where poverty was already a historical constant, the effects were devastating. Families lost their land, workers wandered the roads in search of any opportunity, and hopelessness became visible in prematurely aged faces. In this scenario of economic chaos, The Burke mansion seemed even more out of time, an island of somber stability amidst the general collapse. Surprisingly, Evelyn Burke continued to possess seemingly limitless financial resources. While banks closed and fortunes evaporated, she maintained her property, paid her taxes, and purchased supplies without hesitation. Some speculated that the family's gold was hidden somewhere in the mansion. Others suggested secret investments that had survived the market crash. The truth is, no one knew for sure where her financial stability came from, and no one dared ask directly. During those difficult years, the number of itinerant men on the roads increased exponentially. Displaced workers, unemployed veterans, young men fleeing bankrupt farms, all crossed those mountains in search of something better. For Evelyn, this abundance of potential targets presented unprecedented opportunities. Desperate men were less cautious, more willing to accept offers from strangers, less likely to question minor irregularities when the alternative was sleeping outdoors. In 1931, a fair man named James Mitchell passed through the region. He came from West Virginia, carrying only a worn backpack and stories of closed mines. James was just over 30, but his appearance suggested someone much older, marked by hard work and accumulated disappointment. When night fell near the Burke property, he didn't hesitate to accept the invitation of the elegant woman who appeared offering shelter. It was a choice he wouldn't live to regret. James's wife, a woman named Clara, who had stayed with her family while he looked for work, waited for news for months. When she finally managed to get the money to travel to Kentucky following her husband's last known route, she found only silence and evasive answers. The locals offered little help, too accustomed to stories of disappearances. Clara knocked on the door of the Burke mansion one autumn afternoon, determined to get answers. Evelyn greeted her with apparent sympathy. She listened to Clara's story with a worried expression, confirmed that a man matching the description had asked for shelter months before, but assured her that he had left the following morning with provisions and directions to the nearest town. Clara sensed something was wrong with that encounter, a dissonance between the cordial words and the coldness in Evelyn's eyes. But without proof, without a body, without witnesses, there was nothing she could do but continue searching for ghosts. Clara spent weeks in the region, interviewing anyone who agreed to talk. That's how she met Martin Crawford, now a middle-aged man whose file on the Burkes had grown considerably. He shared his findings with her, showed her the undeniable pattern, and explained why the authorities remained inactive. Clara eventually left Kentucky, but not before vowing that the truth about Evelyn Burke would be revealed, even if it took decades. Meanwhile, the mansion continued its peculiar existence. Distant neighbors sometimes reported strange lights in the windows during the early morning hours, movements on the grounds when it should have been empty, sounds that traveled through the valley on particularly quiet nights. Some attributed these observations to imaginations overstimulated by rumors. Others preferred not to think too much about what really happened on that isolated property. The convenience of willful ignorance maintained the superficial peace of the community. In 1933, an unexpected event brought renewed attention to the Burke mansion. A small fire damaged part of the roof, forcing Evelyn to hire local workers for repairs. During the work, one of the carpenters, a young man named Daniel Warren, accidentally went down to the basement looking for old tools that might be useful. What he found there deeply disturbed him. Daniel later reported to close friends about a heavy metal door he found partially hidden behind old shelves. It had multiple locks, was unusually thick for an interior door, and exuded a peculiar odor when he approached. Before he could investigate further, Evelyn appeared behind him with surprising speed for someone his age. Her voice retained its usual cordiality, but there was an undeniable firmness when she ordered him to return to work on the roof and never go down to the basement again. Daniel completed the job quickly and refused to return to the property, even when Evelyn offered additional payment for minor future repairs. He only mentioned his experience in private conversations, never formally filing a complaint. The culture of silence surrounding the Burkes was so established that even evidence of wrongdoing was treated as personal secrets, not as matters of public interest. Daniel eventually moved to another city, taking his unspoken suspicions far from those oppressive mountains. The Depression years dragged on heavily, but the decade eventually came to an end. Evelyn Burke aged past 60, but her presence in the mansion remained constant. She had become almost a local legend, a folkloric figure about whom people whispered stories. Children in the area were warned never to approach the Burke property, Though parents rarely explained the real reason behind the warning, it was simply accepted that the place carried a darkness that transcended rational explanations. Martin Crawford continued adding documentation to his file, now too voluminous to be easily transported. He had become almost as obsessed as those he criticized for ignoring the evidence. His wife worried about how much this project consumed his life, but Martin felt a moral responsibility to keep the record. Someone needed to remember. Someone needed to document, even if justice never arrived in his lifetime. It was his personal burden, his silent crusade against the impunity that Evelyn's social position guaranteed. The early 1940s brought the shadow of war back to the country. Young men across the nation enlisted or were drafted, and the mountains of Kentucky were no exception. Entire communities were transformed, with women taking on roles previously reserved for men, and the elderly maintaining the land, while their sons and grandsons crossed the ocean to distant battlefields. The Burke Mansion, as always, remained on the fringes of these collective transformations, existing at its own unchanging pace. Evelyn was already in her 70s when World War II began. Her health seemed remarkably good for someone her age, though she was rarely seen outside the property now. Supplies were delivered by messengers who left the goods at the entrance gate and departed quickly, following precise instructions. Very few people were admitted beyond that point, and those who did enter did so with a mixture of morbid curiosity and genuine apprehension. During this period, a nurse named Margaret Sullivan was hired to provide occasional care to Evelyn. Margaret was an experienced professional, having worked in city hospitals before returning to her home region. She didn't believe in rumors or superstitions, approaching her work with medical pragmatism. When she accepted the job at the Burke Mansion, she saw only an opportunity to help an elderly woman living alone. Her perspective would change dramatically in the following weeks. Margaret visited the property 3 times a week, monitoring Evelyn's blood pressure, administering medication and checking for signs of age-related deterioration. During these visits, she began to notice peculiarities she couldn't ignore. Evelyn insisted that Margaret remain only in certain rooms on the upper floor. Entire areas of the house were declared off-limits, locked with multiple padlocks. When Margaret questioned these restrictions, Evelyn offered vague explanations about pending renovations or structural problems. More disturbing were the sounds. Margaret often heard noises coming from deep within the house, metallic echoes reverberating through the thick walls. Evelyn always attributed them to the old plumbing, the wood adjusting with the changing temperatures, the wind whistling through the cracks in the century-old building. The explanations were plausible individually, but accumulated over weeks, they created a pattern that Margaret's rational mind couldn't fully reconcile. On a particularly cold winter afternoon in January 1943, Margaret arrived for her regular visit and found the front door unlocked. She called Evelyn repeatedly, but received no answer. Worried that the elderly woman might have fallen or suffered some medical problem, Margaret cautiously entered the house. She searched the familiar rooms without finding her patient, and finally came upon the stairs leading to the basement. The door at the top was open, something I had never seen before. Margaret descended slowly, calling Evelyn's name, her flashlight cutting through the damp darkness. The cellar was larger than she had imagined, extending beyond what the structure above suggested. There were shelves with dust-covered preserves, rusty tools hanging on the walls, barrels stacked in shadowy corners. Everything seemed abandoned for years, except for one disturbing detail: recent footprints in the dusty floor leading to a specific section of the stone wall. Before Margaret could investigate further, Evelyn's voice echoed behind her. The elderly woman had appeared silently at the top of the stairs, her figure silhouetted against the light from the upper floor. Her voice retained its usual courtesy, but carried a firmness that spurred no questioning. She explained that she had briefly gone out into the garden and forgotten to lock the basement door, and asked Margaret to return upstairs for the routine checkup. Her tone was not conducive to discussion. Margaret climbed slowly, her heart racing for reasons she couldn't fully articulate. The consultation had gone normally, but something had irrevocably changed in the dynamic between them. Evelyn was watching her more intently now, her clear eyes following the nurse's every move. When Margaret left that afternoon, she carried a sense of relief at leaving that property, but also a growing certainty that something was profoundly wrong in that place. In the following nights, Margaret was haunted by thoughts of what might be hidden in that mansion. She knew the stories, of course, everyone in the region knew them. But hearing rumors was different from personally witnessing the strange occurrences. from feeling the oppressive atmosphere of those dark corridors. Margaret considered going to the authorities, but what exactly would she say? That she heard strange sounds, that certain doors were locked, that she felt fear for no apparent reason. None of that constituted evidence of a crime. She decided to speak with Martin Crawford, whose name she had heard mentioned in connection with the Burke mysteries. Martin, now a grey-haired gentleman but still with intense eyes, received her at his home and listened attentively to her account. He didn't seem surprised, merely adding Margaret's observations to his already extensive file. He showed her decades of documentation, drawings that attempted to map the structure of the mansion, based on accounts from different visitors, lists of missing persons that stretched for pages and pages. Margaret was both impressed and horrified by the depth of Martin's investigation. It was clear she had stumbled upon something far bigger than she had initially suspected. Martin explained his frustration with decades of official inaction, with the invisible protection surrounding the Burkes, with the impossibility of penetrating the layers of silence and complicity that kept the secrets buried. He had dedicated much of his adult life to documenting the indefensible, but without the power to force a real investigation. Together, they discussed options. Margaret could try to explore further during her visits, look for concrete evidence, document anything suspicious, but both recognized the risks involved. Evelyn Burke had survived decades of suspicion precisely because she was careful, because she eliminated threats before they became dangerous. Margaret had no illusions about what might happen if she were perceived as a real threat. Still, moral outrage competed with fear, creating an internal conflict she struggled to resolve. In the following weeks, Margaret continued her visits, but now with heightened attention. She memorized room layouts, noticed small details, and tried to mentally map the mansion's internal structure. Evelyn seemed aware of the change. Her vigilance over the nurse intensified. The consultations became shorter, the conversations more limited. The unspoken tension between them grew with each encounter, like a rope stretched to its limit. In March 1943, Margaret found something that would change everything. During a visit, while Evelyn was temporarily out of the room, she noticed a small notebook hidden among the cushions of an old armchair. On impulse, she quickly flipped through its pages. They were notes in old-fashioned handwriting, dates going back decades, names she didn't recognize, numbers that could be measurements or amounts. There was no clear context, but the way everything was recorded suggested meticulous accounting of something that needed to be kept secret. Margaret didn't have time to read more. Evelyn's footsteps echoed in the hallway. She hurriedly put the notebook back and assumed a professional posture when the elderly woman returned. If Evelyn noticed anything wrong, she didn't show it immediately. But that night, Margaret received a message informing her that her services would no longer be needed. The note was polite, thanking her for her dedication and including generous payment for the remaining weeks of the contract. There was no explanation beyond a vague mention of changes in Evelyn's medical care needs. Margaret understood the message. She had crossed some invisible line, and Evelyn was removing it before it became a bigger problem. The nurse felt relieved and frustrated simultaneously. Relieved that she wouldn't have to return to that oppressive mansion, frustrated that she had come so close to discovering something significant. She reported the notebook incident to Martin, who recorded everything carefully, but they both knew that memories of quickly flipped pages didn't constitute admissible evidence. The following months were quiet. The war raged on in distant lands. News arrived late via radio and newspapers, and life in the mountains continued at its ancestral pace. Evelyn Burke remained in her mansion, increasingly reclusive, a ghostly presence haunting the consciences of those who knew or suspected. Martin Crawford continued his documentation work, now with the occasional assistance of Margaret, who had become an ally in his silent crusade. And in the depths of that centuries-old building, secrets waited patiently, protected by walls that would never willingly tell their stories. The end of World War II in 1945 brought a period of transition for the entire country. Soldiers returned transformed by experiences they could never fully articulate. Communities celebrated victories while mourning losses. And a new era of economic prosperity began to slowly emerge. In the mountains of Kentucky, these changes arrived in a filtered and gradual way, but they arrived nonetheless. The Burke mansion, however, remained as it had always been, a temporal anomaly, a place where the past stubbornly refused to give way to the present. Evelyn Burke was now over 75 years old, Her appearance was finally beginning to reflect the passage of time more clearly. Her hair was completely white, her posture slightly stooped, her hands marked by age spots, but her eyes retained that penetrating clarity, that sharp intelligence that had always characterized her presence. She had survived decades of suspicion, outwitted generations of amateur investigators, and seemed determined to see her secrets through to the end, whatever form that end might take. Martin Crawford, now a man in his 60s, felt the weight of age and accumulated frustration. His file on the Burkes occupied 3 locked wooden trunks in his attic, containing decades of meticulous documentation that no one but him and a few confidants had fully reviewed. His wife had died 2 years earlier, his children had moved to larger cities in search of opportunities, and he found himself increasingly alone with the obsession that had defined much of his adult life. Margaret Sullivan remained in the area, working as a visiting nurse for various patients. She maintained occasional contact with Martin, exchanging information whenever something relevant came up. Her brief experience at the Burke mansion had left an indelible mark, a persistent feeling that she had only witnessed the surface of something much deeper and more disturbing. She often wondered about the contents of that notebook she had quickly leafed through, about the names and numbers that suggested a sinister accounting of unthinkable acts. In 1947, a significant event disrupted the established routine. A group of recently returned and unemployed war veterans decided to explore the mountains in search of hunting opportunities and perhaps establish some kind of tourism operation. They were unfamiliar with the local history. They were outsiders who had grown up in other parts of the country and ended up in Kentucky by chance. When they set up camp near the Burke property, they were unaware of the stories surrounding that place. One of them, a veteran named Frank Morrison, ventured near the mansion one morning. He had no hostile intentions, only curiosity about the impressive structure he had spotted through the trees. When he found Evelyn in the garden, he introduced himself politely and commented on the beauty of the property. Evelyn, surprised but quickly regaining her usual composure, thanked him for the compliments and casually mentioned that lone men sometimes got lost in those forests and that it would be wise to keep their companions informed of their whereabouts. The comment sounded strange to Frank. There was something about the way she said it, a particular inflection, a look that lasted a second longer than usual. He left that encounter with an indefinable feeling of unease. Back at camp, he mentioned the experience to his companions. One of them, a local man who had joined the group, visibly paled when Frank described the exact location of the property. It was then that the stories began to be told. Rumors accumulated over decades finally verbalized for those outsiders who were not conditioned by the local silence. The veterans, hardened by war and less impressionable than ordinary civilians, were nonetheless intrigued. They had faced real horrors on European battlefields and Pacific islands, but there was something about the way those stories were told, the genuine fear in the eyes of the locals, that resonated disturbingly. One of them, a former military investigator named Thomas Grant, decided it was worth exploring further. He had experience in gathering intelligence, connecting fragments of scattered information, seeing patterns where others saw only coincidences. Thomas sought out Martin Crawford, whose name had come up repeatedly when veterans began asking questions in the city. Their meeting was eye-opening for both. Martin finally had someone with genuine investigative skills interested in his work, while Thomas gained access to documentation that exceeded his most optimistic expectations. They spent days reviewing the files, with Thomas applying analytical techniques he had learned during his military service. Patterns emerged with renewed clarity under his trained eye. Thomas was particularly interested in logistical questions. How had Evelyn Burke managed to operate for so long without being discovered? Where was the infrastructure necessary for her presumed activities? How did she dispose of evidence in an era without modern technology? The answers, he concluded, must lie in the architecture of the mansion and the surrounding geography. The Burke estate was vast, including forested areas never properly mapped, and the house itself had a history of expansions and modifications over generations. Using old maps from county records, Thomas began to reconstruct the structural evolution of the Burke mansion. Evelyn's grandfather had built the original structure, but documents indicated multiple subsequent additions, including underground excavations supposedly for coal storage. These underground chambers connected to the mining operations that had enriched the family decades earlier, creating a network of tunnels that extended far beyond the visible perimeter of the house. It was the perfect hideaway, accessible only through controlled entrances, invisible to any outside observer. Thomas shared his findings with state authorities, hoping that an outside analysis could finally catalyze an official investigation. He prepared a detailed report, including copies of documents from Martin's file, annotated maps and transcripts of testimony from multiple sources. His hope was that his credibility as a decorated veteran and former military investigator would lend weight to accusations that previous generations had failed to make prosper. However, even with all his experience and preparation, Thomas underestimated the depth of Burke's influence in local politics. His report circulated through various offices, generated some formal meetings, but eventually encountered the same barriers that had frustrated Martin for decades. Without irrefutable physical evidence, without bodies, without witnesses willing to testify under oath, there was no legal basis for an invasive search of the property. The Burkes had donated to political campaigns for generations, had allies in strategic positions, and even though dead for decades, the family legacy offered protection to its last heir. Thomas was furious at the institutional inaction. He had risked his life defending principles of justice in foreign lands, only to discover that those same principles were selectively applied in his own country when vested interests were involved. His frustration echoed Martin's, but was multiplied by the expectation that his external intervention would make a difference. The reality was more complex and disheartening than either of them had anticipated. In October 1948, Thomas made a decision that would change the course of events. He and two fellow veterans decided to conduct their own unofficial investigation of the Burke property. They planned carefully, choosing a moonless night and equipping themselves with tools and flashlights. Their intention was to explore the property's exterior areas, search for entrances to the underground tunnels Thomas believed existed, and collect photographic evidence that could force an official investigation. Martin tried to dissuade them, warning of the legal and personal dangers, but the veterans were determined. The night expedition began well. They managed to cross the perimeter of the property undetected, using silent movement techniques learned during military operations. They located several deteriorated external structures, old buildings linked to mining operations. In one of them, they discovered a partially obstructed entrance leading down to a system of tunnels carved into the rock. The discovery confirmed Thomas's suspicions about the hidden underground infrastructure. But before they could explore further, lights came on in the mansion. Evelyn Burke, despite her advanced age, maintained surprising vigilance over her property. She activated an improvised alarm system, bells connected by wires in the perimeter areas that alerted to intrusions. The veterans heard the metallic sounds echoing in the night and made the sensible decision to retreat. They had found evidence of the underground infrastructure, which was already significant, and they didn't want to risk a confrontation that could result in criminal charges against them. Back at camp, Thomas photographed his own notes and maps, documenting the exact location of the tunnel entrance they had discovered. The next morning, he planned to take everything to the state prosecutor's office, arguing that they now had concrete evidence of an undeclared underground structure that warranted an official investigation. It was a tenuous thread of hope, but it was more than any previous investigator had managed to obtain. However, Evelyn Burke had not survived so many decades of passively accepting threats. The following morning, before Thomas could present his findings, the local sheriff appeared at the veterans' camp. Evelyn had filed a formal complaint about trespassing, presenting evidence that her land had been violated overnight. Anonymous witnesses had supposedly seen armed men near the mansion, creating a narrative of threat that completely reversed the situation. The veterans suddenly found themselves on the defensive, their findings tainted by the illegality of how they were obtained. Thomas tried to explain the context, to present his reasons, but the sheriff wasn't interested in philosophical debates about justice versus legality. The trespassing laws were clear, and the veterans had technically violated them regardless of their motivations. They received formal warnings and the not-so-subtle suggestion that they should leave the area before more serious charges were filed. Burke's influence, even filtered through generations and transformed into diffuse political capital, was still enough to protect Evelyn from unwanted scrutiny. The veterans left a few days later, frustrated, but recognizing the futility of continuing to fight against a system that clearly did not want to be disturbed. Thomas left copies of all his research with Martin, including the photographs and maps of the underground structures. It was all they could do, preserve the knowledge and hope that someday, somehow, the truth would find its way to light. Martin added these documents to his archive, now so voluminous that he had lost count of how many individual cases he was documenting. His personal crusade continued, solitary and seemingly endless, against an injustice that had perpetuated itself through decades of institutional silence. The 1950s brought cultural and technological transformations that finally began to penetrate even the most isolated regions of Appalachia. Roads were paved, telephone lines expanded, television reached rural homes, connecting previously separate communities to the wider world. But the Burke mansion remained a notable exception, refusing to participate in this modernization. Evelyn never installed a telephone, never allowed electricians to extend cables to her property, deliberately maintaining her residence in a state of almost anachronistic isolation. In 1952, Evelyn Burke turned 80. The news circulated quietly through the community, generating whispered conversations about how she had lived so long, about what kept that woman still breathing when so many others of her generation had already passed away. Some attributed her longevity to robust genes, others spoke in darker terms of unnatural pacts and stolen energies. Speculation ranged from the rational to the superstitious, but all agreed on one point. There was something extraordinary, albeit unsettling, about Evelyn Burke's persistence. Martin Crawford was now in his final years. His health was gradually deteriorating, arthritis made writing difficult, and his eyesight was weakening under the weight of decades examining documents in inadequate light. But he maintained his vigilance, occasionally adding new information to the archive that had become his life's work. Margaret Sullivan continued to visit him regularly, no longer as an active collaborator, but as a witness to the extraordinary dedication of a man who refused to let injustice be forgotten. It was during one of these visits, on a rainy April afternoon in 1953, that Martin finally verbalized something he had been considering for years. He was old. He had no heirs interested in continuing his crusade, and all that accumulated knowledge risked dying with him. Margaret, who had become the only true custodian of his trust, would need to decide what to do with decades of documentation after his death. It was a heavy burden, a responsibility she hadn't asked for, but seemed inevitably destined to bear. Margaret accepted the responsibility with the seriousness it deserved. Together, they organized the archive more systematically, creating indexes and summaries that would allow someone in the future to quickly understand the scope of the investigation. Martin wrote a detailed introduction explaining how the project had begun, why it had persisted despite all the frustrations, and what hope he still harbored that eventually the truth would prevail. It was simultaneously a manifesto, a testament and an appeal to posterity. Meanwhile, rumors began to circulate about changes at the Burke mansion. Distant neighbors noticed less activity than usual, smoke rising from the chimneys less frequently, no sign of the rare messengers who had previously appeared occasionally. Some speculated that Evelyn was finally succumbing to old age, that her days were numbered, that this dark chapter of local history would finally end with her death. There was an almost palpable expectation, a feeling that something was coming to an end. In June 1954, Martin Crawford passed away peacefully in his sleep. His funeral was discreet, attended by few, but those present recognized they were saying goodbye to a man who had dedicated decades to trying to bring justice where others had given up. Margaret took custody of his trunks of documents, transporting them to a safe space in her own home. She didn't yet know what she would do with that legacy, but she was determined to preserve it until an opportunity presented itself. Just 3 months after Martin's death, in September 1954, startling news spread through the community. Evelyn Burke had passed away. A messenger had found her body in the mansion, seated in her favorite armchair in the library, apparently having departed during the night. There were no signs of violence or struggle, just a very old woman who had finally reached the inevitable end of an extraordinarily long life. The news generated mixed feelings, relief that unsettling presence was no longer there, but also a sense of missed opportunity, of questions that would never be answered directly. Evelyn Burke's will turned out to be a peculiar document. She had no direct heirs, no close relatives who could claim the property. The document stipulated that the mansion and all its land be donated to the county, with the explicit condition that the structure be preserved as it was, without modifications or demolitions, for a period of 50 years. It also established a modest fund for basic maintenance, sufficient to keep the roof in good condition and prevent catastrophic structural deterioration, but nothing beyond that. The preservation clause caused consternation among those who had hoped to see the property finally thoroughly searched. The county accepted the donation, legally bound by the terms of the will. The Burke mansion had become, by legal decree, a kind of forced time capsule, frozen in its final state for half a century. Some interpreted this as Evelyn's last act of control, ensuring that her secrets remained buried even after her death. Others saw it simply as the final eccentricity of a woman who had lived her entire life by her own rules. Margaret Sullivan saw in Evelyn's death an opportunity she couldn't pass up. With the mansion now public property, albeit restricted by testamentary conditions, it should be possible to conduct some kind of official investigation. She contacted state authorities, presented parts of Martin's file, and argued that the owner's death eliminated many of the legal complications that had prevented previous investigations. Her persistence eventually resulted in a formal inspection of the property. The inspection took place in November 1954, conducted by a small team that included the county sheriff, a structural engineer, and a state investigator. Margaret obtained permission to accompany them as a civilian observer, representing, in a way, the work of Martin Crawford. When they entered the mansion for the first time since Evelyn's death, they found a structure preserved in a state of temporal suspension, as if the owner could return at any moment. The main floor revealed little more than antique furniture, dusty books, and personal belongings from a life lived in self-imposed isolation. The second floor contained rooms that had been closed for decades, beds made with sheets yellowed by time, and clothes hanging in closets that reeked of mothballs. It was the basement that held the secrets that generations had suspected but never managed to confirm. The team descended the stairs with powerful flashlights, illuminating corners that rarely saw daylight. The main cellar matched the previous descriptions, a spacious area with shelves of old preserves, tools, the usual remnants of a self-sufficient residence. But the structural engineer noticed something that others had missed or ignored. The dimensions of the cellar, when compared to the structure above, did not match. There was unaccounted space, suggesting additional chambers hidden behind the apparent walls. Following this intuition, they began to examine the stone walls more carefully. Behind a heavy bookcase anchored to the wall but movable with sufficient effort, they found the door. It was made of reinforced metal, thick and heavy, with multiple locks that had rusted slightly but remained intact. The keys were eventually located among Evelyn's personal belongings, kept in a small box in her room. With considerable effort, they managed to open the locks one by one, until finally the door gave way with a metallic groan that echoed ominously in the silence of the basement. What they found beyond that door confirmed decades of suspicions and surpassed their worst fears. A stone staircase descended to an even deeper level, carved directly into the solid rock of the mountain. The air emanating from below was cold, damp, laden with odors that the team couldn't fully identify, but instinctively recognized as linked to decay and stagnant time. With flashlights in hand and controlled breathing, they began their descent into the chambers that Evelyn Burke had kept sealed all her life. The subterranean chambers proved to be more extensive than any investigator had imagined. Narrow corridors branched off in multiple directions, some leading to small compartments carved into the rock, others ending abruptly in solid walls. The architectural ingenuity was impressive, demonstrating careful planning over decades. That space had been built to remain hidden, to guard secrets that should never emerge to the surface. Margaret Sullivan accompanied the team through those tunnels with a mixture of vindication and horror. Everything Martin Crawford had documented during decades of solitary investigation was being confirmed before her eyes. The suspicions, the whispered rumors, the stories dismissed as rural exaggerations, all contained kernels of truth that could no longer be denied. The magnitude of what Evelyn Burke had managed to conceal for so long was astounding in its complexity. The official investigation lasted weeks. Experts were called in, documents were catalogued, every inch of those cameras was photographed and meticulously mapped. The Burke mansion became the center of state attention, with journalists trying to get information, curious onlookers gathering at the gates, and authorities struggling to maintain some control over the emerging narrative. It was as if decades of enforced silence had finally exploded into revelations that could no longer be contained. Margaret provided the investigation with Martin Crawford's entire archive, decades of documentation that now took on new meaning. The names he had listed, The patterns he had identified, the connections he had traced, everything fit into a much larger and darker picture. Martin's work was recognized posthumously, his persistence finally validated, though he was no longer alive to witness the justice he had so earnestly sought. The discoveries in the underground chambers raised profound questions about how someone could operate for so long without detection, about the systemic flaws that allowed suspicions to be ignored, about the role that social position and influence played in protecting the powerful from scrutiny. The local community faced a collective reckoning, forced to acknowledge its passive complicity, its convenient silence, its choices to look the other way when suspicions arose. In the following months, investigators attempted to identify and notify families of possible victims. It was a painful and incomplete process. Many of the missing had been men without strong ties, solitary travelers whose absences were never adequately investigated. Some families finally received answers to questions they had carried for decades, a belated but significant closure. Others would never know for sure the fate of their loved ones, remaining in a limbo of unconfirmed suspicions. Burke Manor became an enduring symbol of how evil can thrive when societies choose convenient ignorance over uncomfortable truths. The building remained standing as stipulated in Evelyn's will, but its presence transformed from a silent intimidation to an unwitting monument to human failings. Occasional visitors paused at the gates, contemplating the decaying structure, reflecting on the secrets its walls had guarded for so long. Margaret Sullivan lived for another 20 years after those events, carrying on the legacy of Martin Crawford and her own experience as a witness. She often reflected on how history might have been different if the warning voices had been heeded decades earlier, if social standing hadn't created shields of protection, if justice hadn't been so frequently obstructed by political and social considerations. Her reflections were bitter, but also contained hope that lessons would be learned. Years passed, and the Burke mansion gradually deteriorated despite minimal maintenance efforts. Nature began to reclaim the space that human construction had temporarily dominated. Vines covered the exterior walls, tiles fell without being replaced, windows shattered and remained open to the elements. It was as if the building itself was slowly crumbling under the weight of the secrets it had carried, unable to sustain its physical structure now that its dark purpose had been revealed. The story of Evelyn Burke entered local folklore, transforming from whispered rumor into documented narrative that served as a warning. Subsequent generations learned about the events through books, documentaries, and the stories that survive when communities need to process collective trauma. The name Burke became synonymous with prolonged deception, with how refined appearances can mask deeply disturbing natures, with how collective silence allows horrors to continue uninterrupted. The underground chambers were eventually sealed for structural safety reasons, filled with concrete to prevent collapses and impede unauthorized access. It was like burying the secrets a second time, though now not for concealment but out of practical necessity. The mountain reclaimed those spaces, absorbing them back into its rocky mass, making them inaccessible, except through photographic records and testimonies from those who witnessed them before the final sealing. We journeyed through one of the most disturbing stories these mountains have held. It's a reminder that evil doesn't always present itself in an obvious way, that it often hides behind respectable facades, protected by social structures that prefer comfort to truth. The persistence of those who refused to accept silence as an answer eventually brought light where shadows had reigned for decades. Burke Manor no longer exists in the form we know from this narrative. Time and the elements have completed the work that human investigations began, reducing that imposing structure to partial ruins that barely suggest its original configuration. But the story persists, passed down through generations, a cautionary tale about vigilance, about questioning authority, about never allowing social standing to create immunity from scrutiny. If this story touched you in any way, consider subscribing to the channel to follow more narratives that explore the dark corners of history. Each story we share carries lessons about human nature, about society, about how individual and collective choices shape the world around us. Leave a comment sharing your reflections, and don't forget to like if you enjoyed this journey.